Well, today as we begin our message, I'd like to tell you a true story. This story involves 31-year-old Hugo, a man who had immigrated to America from Guatemala, and he lived in New York City. This story takes place on April 18th of 2010. As Hugo was going down the street, he noticed that a woman was being attacked by a man who had a knife. And so he rushed to her aid and tackled her attacker. Well, in the process of the scuffle, Hugo was stabbed and fell and was left to die on the street. The woman took off in one direction, the attacker took off in the other direction, and Hugo lay on the sidewalk. This is an actual surveillance shot from a camera that was taken on the corner. One man came up while Hugo was laying there, took out his cell phone, and snapped a picture. 18 people walked by Hugo, looking down to notice that he was there, and kept on walking. One person walked up and shook his body violently and then kept on walking. An unknown man, almost an hour later, called the local police precinct to report that someone was lying on the sidewalk. And so the police got there about an hour after the video camera recorded Hugo trying to save the woman's life. But by the time the police arrived, Hugo was dead. Now, we hear a story like that and we wonder, how could all of those people ignore his desperate need? What would motivate such deliberate inaction? You know, the truth is, friends, we never live far away from the parable of the Good Samaritan that Jesus told. Because in his story, there were passers-by who could have stopped and offered assistance, but didn't. They may have thought that they had good reason to avoid the situation. The priest and the Levite, a little bit different characters than our skit. The priest and the Levite both felt bound by social rules that would determine whether they could respond or not to this desperate man. Well, there's a New Testament scholar by the name of Kenneth Bailey that explains why the priest and the Levite may have felt that they couldn't help that wounded victim. The victim in the Bible was beaten to the point of death, and he was robbed of his clothes. He was laying naked, virtually, along the road. And normally his clothing would have marked him as a Jewish person. But because his clothing had been robbed, you could not tell by looking at him what his ethnic background was. And also, because he was half dead, he was probably unconscious, which meant that he could not communicate with the person who would be helping him. It might have been impossible to tell whether he was actually alive or dead. In other words, because the priest and the Levite couldn't tell if the victim was one of their own kind and what state he was left in, they both decided to pass him by. There were rules of engagement that these two men lived by, and they created boundaries around their consideration for who they would help. And these boundaries were so strong that they trumped compassion, emotion, and the need to act. How sad. We look at their action and we think, tisk, tisk, tisk. How sad. Now we have to back up a minute and remember that this was a parable that Jesus told. And we have to ask, why did Jesus tell this story? Jesus was having a conversation with a lawyer. And this lawyer was just a little bit self-righteous, considered himself an expert in the law. And his question to Jesus initially was, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, well, what do you read in the law? And the lawyer answered, love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love my neighbor as myself. And Jesus commended him. Said, yeah, that's it. You do that, you'll have eternal life. But then the passage goes on to say that the lawyer wanted to justify himself, make himself appear righteous. And so he said, well then, who is my neighbor? Do you think we hear a bit of arrogance in his voice? Do you think we hear a bit of, let me measure how compassionate I really have to be? Well, in the Saunders house, we love to watch old westerns. And in the old westerns, you can tell the good guys from the bad guys by what they're wearing on their head. The good guys wear, yes, and they come riding in on a white horse going, hi-ho, silver, away! And the bad guys wear black. You guys watch old westerns too, don't you? And they do everything that they can to bring evil to someone else. In those old westerns, the stereotypes, they hold true. But when Jesus identified the Samaritan as the good guy in the story, the one who acted with compassion and as a neighbor, he would have turned his audience's world upside down. Because any Samaritan was hated by the Jews, just by virtue of his ethnic background. That was a centuries-old prejudice, and yet this Samaritan, who simply by his ethnic label would have been an enemy, he was the one that was moved to compassion. He was the one that went the extra mile to make sure that the Jewish victim would have everything he needed, not to just survive, but to thrive. Now, I want to go back to something that Dr. Bailey, our New Testament scholar, describes this as, because, you know, if you visit my house and go down in my husband's office, you'll see a picture of John Wayne on the wall. And any house that has a picture of John Wayne on the wall would understand this analogy. Because Dr. Bailey says that the Samaritan taking the injured person to an inn in Jericho would be like a Plains Indian walking into Dodge City in 1875 with a wounded and scalped cowboy laying across the top of his saddle. He would be checking into that Long Branch saloon, and he would be spending the night there with his own wampum, taking care of that cowboy. And what do we know about that Plains Indian? He'd have been lucky to get out of Dodge alive. It would have taken incredible courage for that Samaritan to have followed through taking care of that Jewish victim, risking his own well-being to care for this person who, if the tables had been turned, likely would not have lifted a finger to help him. That's who we're talking about. So for this lawyer and for us, this parable is about a lesson of compassion, Christian compassion, that trumps boundaries. Because if the question that the lawyer asked Jesus is, "Who is my neighbor?" then the answer is the very next person you meet, no matter what. It doesn't matter their skin color. It doesn't matter their ethnic background. It doesn't matter the bad choices they've made in life. It doesn't matter the family that they came from. Who is my neighbor? The next person you meet that is in need. Now, since the earliest days of the church, the listeners of this parable have understood that the Good Samaritan is actually a Christ figure. Because, friends, we are the wounded and dying. We are the broken and half dead laying along the side of the road. We are spiritually broken. And Jesus, who leaves the splendor of heaven, sees our need and moves with compassion to come down to this broken earth. Jesus will pay dearly for that decision, and yet he acts willfully, decidedly, and with extravagant cost to himself. Jesus is our living sacrifice, doing everything needed to restore us to life. Did God get your attention? Are you awake? Now, my question as we end today is, who do you have a tendency to turn a blind eye to? Who, if they were in need, would you have a tendency to walk right by and not respond? Because the challenge for all of us is to open our hearts with Christian compassion, to not live in self-centeredness, but to extend ourselves for the benefit of others. Who is my neighbor? The next person that God places in my path and brings to my attention. Because Jesus taught, as we extend mercy, so shall we receive it.